Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I'll talk about Nicobarese languages today. As you probably all know, Nicobarese is a separate subgroup of Austroasiatic represented on the Nicobar Islands, which are today part of India, but are geographically much closer to Sumatra and other parts of Southeast Asia than to the Indian mainland. It's a relatively small subgroup consisting of around 7 languages. All of them are more or less endangered. Kar and Nankari are the least endangered languages here. And according to a recent proposal by Paul Sidwell, Nicobarese consists of 3 branches. We have Kar in the north, we have Shompen in the south, and then a 3rd branch consisting of all the remaining central and southern Nicobarese languages. Nicobarese is special in that it's the only AA subgroup exclusively represented on island. That is, it's geographically isolated from the rest of AA, but that doesn't mean that it's completely isolated. Paul Sidwell and also Gérard Difflot at some point suggests that there's a distantly subgroup with Aslian languages. And there's also, or there was extensive trading relations of Nicobarese speakers with speakers of other languages, especially also Austronesian languages. Research on Nicobarese languages is still limited. Kar and Nankari are the best described Nicobarese languages. As Paul just mentioned, there's some newly available material on Senenyo and Lura. The remaining languages, Shompen and Little and Great Nicobarese, is almost undescribed. We basically only have word lists of those languages. Now, the goals of this talk is to present grammatical features with respect to which Nicobarese languages are typologically unusual in the AA and also mainland Southeast Asian context, and then try to account for the differences by investigating how they arose diachronically. Here we can distinguish between preserved structures versus innovated structures. That is, languages can become different when one language preserves the structure, another language innovates and changes. Therefore, of course, languages can also become different if several languages change in different ways. If they change, we can distinguish between language internal change versus contact influence. And here, for Nicobarese languages, that especially concerns Austronesian languages, I would suggest. Coming to the first unusual feature, here you can see a quite typical consonant inventory here from Nankari. Now, overall, it looks fairly typical Austroasiatic with one notable exception, and that's the plosive series. There's only one plosive series, which makes it the smallest plosive inventory of all of AA. For instance, for Proto-Austroasiatic, we reconstruct 3 series, 3 plosive series, voiceless, voice, and implosive. Most mainland Southeast Asian AA languages have 2 or 3 series. Some also have 4 series, but 1 is quite uncommon. So we can conclude that the reduction to 1 series is an innovation. It's not a preservation of an old pattern. It's an innovation, which is genealogically and also areally uncommon. For instance, in Austronesian languages, we usually have 2 series, at least in the Austronesian languages spoken nearby. Shompen is a bit of an exception. As you can see, Shompen has a much larger consonant inventory consisting of 4 plosive series, incidentally the same as in South Asian languages. Shompen also has two velar fricatives, and notably no rhotics, no R sounds. But we also have to, well, okay, yeah, that means that it looks quite different from other Nicobarese languages. But as I already mentioned, we don't know that much about Champagne, and there's no thorough investigation on the phonology and on phoneme inventories. So we might have to have another look at the phonology to see if that's actually the correct analysis I present here. Next unusual feature is syllable structure, which is quite simple. CVC is the maximal syllable structure in Nicobarese languages, which is less complex than in most mainland Southeast Asian AA languages. It's also notable that there are no sesquisyllabic words in Nicobarese languages, which are typical of mainland Southeast Asian AA languages, and also reconstructed for Proto-Austroasiatic. On the other hand, polysyllabic words are common in Nicobarese. Words are often longer than in mainland Southeast Asian languages, and that's on the one hand a result of the syllabification of former consonant clusters. On the other hand, it's also a result of morphologically more complex words, and here I assume that morphosyntactic words correspond to phonological words. We have different morphological processes which are frequent and productive. Those are not only prefixing and infixing, also compounding and reduplication, also some coda copying. But notably, we also have suffixing, which, as far as I know, is basically not present in mainland Southeast Asian AA languages. You will see some examples for these structures in the examples on the coming slides. Next unusual feature of Nicobarese languages is flagging on core arguments. Flagging, I have to mention, is a cover term for case marking and adpositional marking, which is useful in many languages because most languages in the world don't have such a clear-cut distinction between case marking and adpositions as the usual Indo-European languages of Europe. And here we can have a look at the flagging patterns in CAR. Many arguments in CAR do not have flagging, especially in the VPA word order. But then we have VAP word order clauses where the P argument comes last and often receives the flagging. Here you see two examples. First the verb, then the A argument, followed by the P argument. Here I gloss the as oblique. Interestingly, sometimes the verb also has some voice marking. I gloss it here as antipassive, but I'm not sure if that's actually the correct analysis here. We might need, or I might have to have another look at the data. But here again, we see first the A argument without flagging, then the P argument with the flagging. Then we also have passive clauses with VPA word order, and here the A argument has the flagging, the same the flagging as the P argument has in the previous clauses. Here again, an example. First, the verb with the passive morphology. As you can also notice, in this case at least, the passive morpheme has the same shape as the antipassive morpheme in the previous example, but the passive morphology or passive has many other allomorphs also. So I still have to look if that's actually the same morpheme. If it's the same morpheme, then we might want to analyze it as a kind of maybe middle marking. I'm not sure about this yet. But here in the last example, you see we have the verb first, then we have the A argument without flagging, and then we have the P argument with the flagging. Now we can also look at the flagging functions of cognates of the morpheme in other AA languages. I have to mention that these cognates usually also have other functions than flagging. For instance, often they work as a subordinating morpheme. So here I only look at flagging functions. In many mainland Southeast Asian ICAAL languages, the or da morpheme mostly flags oblique arguments, also recipients or D arguments, because it works a bit similar to a dative morpheme. For instance, here in the Shui example, Shui is a phalangic language. Here we can see that the recipient argument, the G argument, has the da flagging. More rarely, we also find it on P arguments, and that's especially true for verb initial clauses in some phalangic languages. Here, for instance, we have an example from Rumai, where you can see we have the verb, then the A argument followed by the P argument, and the P argument has that da marking. We can also reconstruct this morpheme for Proto-Austroasiatic, and yeah, it's a bit unclear what exactly the functions of these morphemes were. We could suggest that it probably flagged the second post-verbal NP. So for instance, if you have VAP word order clauses, then it flagged the P argument, or in AVP word order patterns, it could flag an additional argument or adjunct that followed the P. But what's unique to CAR is that this morpheme also flags A arguments. As far as I know, this is not found in mainland Southeast Asian ICAAL languages. It's also noteworthy that the distribution of the morpheme in CAR is reminiscent of symmetric voice constructions found in conservative Austronesian languages, also known as Philippine type languages. We can say that the flags the core argument that is not the privileged syntactic argument that is, or the subject. Also, it doesn't demote arguments. That is, we have one construction which we can describe as an unmarked or antipassive construction, or in Austronesian terms, we can call it an agent voice construction, where the A argument is the PSA, the P argument is the other core argument and receives the flagging. But then we also have a passive construction, or in Austronesian terms, we could call it a patient voice construction, where the P argument is the privileged syntactic argument or subject, and the A is the other core argument and the argument that receives the marking. So I would suggest this just looks quite Austronesian, and therefore we can assume that there is some Austronesian influence on the development of these constructions. Here with this slide, I just want to briefly mention that there are also other flagging markers, other flagging in Nicobarese languages, not only the, which is usually just an accusative flag. We also find nominative flags, usually coming from a weakly grammatical eidectic element. In Jara or Sanenyo, we even find a distinction between visible and invisible nominative. Beside the nominative, we also find a dative morpheme or dative flag in some languages, usually with the shape din, which is etymologically a combination of the and the accusative the and the nominative in morpheme, and usually flags indirect objects. In non-Kari, we also have an instrumental flag dai coming from the word for hand, which flags A arguments in passive constructions. It's also worth noticing that flagging only occurs on a subset of arguments in all those languages. That is, these languages have differential flagging, and many arguments do not have flagging. Okay, next unusual feature is verb agreement. In CAR, we sometimes find bound person forms that co-occur with co-referential MPs. We find S agreement, as in this example here, where you can see the C is here the S argument, and we have here an agreement marker, third person. We also have P agreement in some instances. For instance, here the book is the P agreement, and we have here third person singular agreement. A arguments do not have agreement, so we have here an ergative alignment pattern. In non-Korea, we also find some potential agreement functions, especially in polar interrogative and negative clauses. It seems to be restricted to A. In a clause like this, am I coming? You see, we have two first-person forms. I would suggest that the first is an agreement marker, and the second is the actual pronominal argument, here even with flagging. We find similar patterns in Jara or Sanenyu, but still poorly described up to this point. Overall, we can say that agreement is also present in some Austronesian languages nearby, for instance, in Nias and Engano, but the patterns differ. They have prefixes and split ergativity, so it's a bit unclear if contact plays a role. We can also look at word order, and here we find a quite unusual pattern in Nicobarese languages, namely VPA word order. There are also other patterns, VAP and AVP word order. AVP, for instance, also occurs in subordinate clauses in car, as you can see here, where we have a special subordinate pronoun followed by the verb here. And we can also look at the agreement forms, the bound person forms, and here we have VS and VP patterns in car, and SV, an SV pattern in non-Korean Jara. We also know that agreement markers and word order in subordinate clauses have a tendency to reflect more conservative patterns, and therefore I would suggest that the basic word order of Proto-Nicobarese could have been SV or VS and AVP. They have that in common with many mainland Southeast Asian AA languages. That is, they commonly change from verb initial to verb medial. If we want to reconstruct verb initial word order for Proto-Austroasiatic, but I think we should. But that also means that the VPA pattern in Nicobarese is a later development. It's uncommon within AA and also worldwide. But it's also found in conservative Austronesian languages, for instance, in varieties of Batak and Nias, and therefore we could still assume that there was some contact influence of Austronesian languages. So coming to the conclusions, in what way are Nicobarese languages unusual in the AA context? They're unusual in having only one plosive series, in having a very simple syllable structure, no CC clusters, in having longer words consisting of more than one morphemes, usually, and also suffixing. We frequently find flagging of core arguments. We also find that in ASEAN, but ASEAN languages have different forms and also different patterns. We find some agreement. Again, we find some agreement in ASEAN languages, but ASEAN languages again have different forms and patterns. The word order VPA is quite unusual. And we can conclude that most of these patterns are actually the result of innovations rather than preservations of conservative AA patterns, with two exceptions, which are presumably preserved from Proto-Austroasiatic, and that is productive prefixation and infixation, but not suffixation, and also the da flagging on P arguments. Finally, I'd also like to address Austronesian contact influence. VPA order is very uncommon worldwide. Therefore, I would suggest that here we can find some influence, or influence is probable. Suffixing, well, here we might also find some influence, but suffixing is much more common worldwide. So I think suffixing could also arise independently of Austronesian languages. Flagging of core arguments, well, here we see striking similarities, especially in car, but otherwise it's less clear. Agreement, well, only limited similarities, because it's unclear if contact played a role. But it's also noteworthy mentioning that we only find borrowing of patterns, but not concrete forms and words. I mean, there are some more recent Malay loanwords in Nicobarese languages, but not, let's say, ancient Batak or Nias loanwords, as far as I know. That suggests that the nature of the contact was substrate influence. That means Austronesian speakers switched to ICAAL languages, to the Nicobarese languages, but the exact scenario or the circumstances are unclear, and much more research is obviously still needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. We already have one comment or question by Paul in the chat. Oh, I see that Roger has raised his hand. Maybe you can ask your question first, and then I will read the question from the chat. So Roger, you can ask your question.
Roger, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I was actually trying to clap, but I got the wrong thing. So
Okay, I think it's pretty common. It happened a lot today. So then I will read Paul's comment / question. My simplistic analysis of the in Nicobarese was that it marks the argument with the lowest status in the clause. Does that make sense?
I would say, if you mean by lowest status, only core arguments with the lowest status, then yes. But for instance, okay, we can say that in, for instance, passive in non-Kauri, here we could argue that the A argument is not an argument actually, but an adjunct. If we use that analysis, then I think your statement is correct. I just used A and P more in semantic terms. And if we use it in that way, then we would, for instance, also expect to mark the A argument in passive clauses in non-Kauri, which it does not, right? Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah, I see. I'm just I'm always trying to think of the historical path, and so the passive and anti-passive is interesting, and we, you know, it depends how old we think those constructions are like that.
Yeah, sure. But at least the anti-passive construction doesn't look very Austroasiatic, right?
Yeah, yeah, it stands out. Yeah,
that seems to be an innovation, which I would argue, since it looks a bit Austronesian, could be a result of some Austronesian influence.
I mean, I think there clearly was some sort of deep Austronesian influence, and it's interesting that the parallels, syntactic parallels, you see them with the languages of the islands south of Sumatra. So it's other small island groups.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially in Nias, especially.
Yeah.
Engano, for instance, seem to have switched to some less conservative Austronesian patterns, but in older descriptions, it also looks quite Philippine type like.
Yeah, yeah, but so I think the Malay influence on Nicobarese is much later. I think there's some earlier influence, which is, you know, very, it's teasing us.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, it looks interesting.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Okay, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I have just a comment really. I've been arguing for some time that the Austronesians were extremely active in the whole Bay of Bengal area in the early period of expansion, and were moving populations around. And one of the interesting things that connects Engano with Nicobarese area are the type of early houses. That the Enganese had these extraordinary beehive houses, which of course have disappeared, which look pretty similar, amazingly similar to some of the Nicobarese houses. So to me, there is certainly evidence the Austronesians were extremely busy, active, and in my version of reality anyway, they actually carried the Nicobarese to the Nicobar Islands, but we can't prove that, but it makes sense, and it's certainly that sort of relationship would account for the substrate type thing where you get, I think Michael Ross would have called it metatypy. You get similar forms, but you don't actually get segmental cognates.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. It's also noteworthy that Engana is the most isolated Austronesian language of those islands southwest of Sumatra. So it could be that the beehives are actually reflecting in a more ancient pattern of Engano culture that was also preserved in the Nicobar Islands. That's a scenario I could imagine.
Maybe I'll ask one tiny question in link with the contact with Austronesian. Have you looked at like recent genetic studies or?
Only to a limited degree, but as far as I understand it, the Nicobarese still have more connections to mainland Southeast Asia than to island Southeast Asia. I have to admit that I should have a closer look at the genetics.
Yeah, from what I remember too, but but maybe it's worth looking at the latest findings. I don't know. There was a paper.
You're right. Yeah.
There was a paper last year on population history of the Nicobarese, of the Nicobar.
Oh, true. Yeah.
But I don't know if anything has been done since then. Maybe we have time for one more question. If anyone has a question or a comment, otherwise, okay. Otherwise, we can thank Tobias one more time, and then we have a break before the next session. Thank you very much, Tobias.
Well, thank you.